Xavier texted me 30 minutes before our anniversary dinner. Can't make it, babe. The boys need me for raids tonight. I stared at my phone in my brand new dress that cost half my paycheck, reading those words over and over again like maybe if I looked at them enough times, they would somehow rearrange themselves into an apology, or literally anything that showed he gave a damn about me or about us, or about the fact that we had been planning this dinner for weeks, and I had made reservations at that Italian place he claimed to love, even though I suspected he only said that because it was the first restaurant that came to mind when I asked him where he wanted to go for our anniversary. And now here I was, standing in front of my mirror looking at myself in this gorgeous emerald dress that hugged every curve and made me feel beautiful for the first time in months, with my hair done up in those soft curls that had taken me an hour to perfect, and my makeup applied so carefully that I had watched 3 YouTube tutorials just to get the winged eyeliner right, and my feet were already killing me in these strappy heels that I had bought specifically for tonight, even though I knew I would probably never wear them again. Because when do I ever have occasion to dress up like this when my boyfriend's idea of a date night is ordering pizza and watching him play League of Legends on the couch? This was literally the 3rd time he had stood me up for our anniversary. And I had enough this time because the first year I had told myself it was just bad timing, and the guild really did need him for that progression raid. And the 2nd year I had convinced myself that work stress was making him forgetful, even though deep down I knew he just didn't care enough to mark it on his calendar, or set a reminder, or do any of the 1,000 little things that people do when something actually matters to them. But this 3rd year felt different because I had explicitly reminded him 5 times in the past week. I had sent him calendar invites. I had even texted him this morning asking if he was excited about tonight. And he had responded with a thumbs up emoji, which should have been my first red flag that he wasn't taking this seriously at all. I immediately drove to his apartment because I wanted him to see exactly what he was choosing those dumb pixels over. Wanted him to look at me in this dress and realize what he was throwing away for another night of screaming at strangers on the internet. Wanted him to feel even a fraction of the disappointment and hurt that was currently making my chest feel tight and my eyes burn with unshed tears that I refused to let fall because I had spent too long on this mascara to let him ruin it before I even got the chance to make him feel guilty. The drive over felt surreal, like I was watching myself from outside my body as I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, and I kept rehearsing what I would say to him, practicing my angry speech in my head where I would tell him exactly how selfish and inconsiderate he was being. But I also knew that the second I saw him I would probably just deflate, because that's what always happened when I tried to confront him about anything. He would give me those puppy dog eyes and promise to do better, and I would believe him like an idiot because I wanted so desperately to believe that the guy I fell in love with 2 years ago was still in there somewhere underneath all the gaming addiction and the Discord moderator responsibilities and the complete inability to prioritize our relationship over his virtual life. The second I walked through the door, I could hear him screaming at his monitor, his voice carrying through the apartment with that particular pitch of rage that only comes from someone who has died in a video game and is blaming everyone except themselves for their mistakes. And I could make out phrases like, "Why didn't you heal me?" And "That's such bullshit." And "You guys are literally trash." Which made me wonder for the millionth time why he chose to spend all his free time with people he clearly hated playing games that made him this angry, instead of spending time with me, the person who actually loved him and wanted to make him happy, and was currently standing in his living room in a dress that made me feel like $1,000,000, while he couldn't even be bothered to acknowledge my existence. Then I heard a voice from the kitchen say, "Wow, that dress is way too nice for getting stood up." It was Hunter, Xavier's roommate who had moved in 6 months ago, when their 3rd friend moved out to live with his girlfriend. And honestly, Hunter had been nothing but kind and respectful to me since day one, always making conversation when I came over, always offering me coffee or asking how my day was, always treating me like a human being instead of just an inconvenient interruption to gaming time like Xavier had started doing. He was pouring himself a glass of whiskey from what looked like an expensive bottle, the amber liquid catching the kitchen light as it splashed into the crystal tumbler that was such a stark contrast to the collection of stained plastic cups and chipped mugs that Xavier accumulated like trophies of his inability to do dishes. Hunter looked showered and dressed like an actual adult in dark jeans and a fitted button-down shirt that was actually ironed. His hair was styled instead of matted with grease, and he smelled like actual cologne instead of that combination of body odor and energy drink that seemed to permanently cling to Xavier these days. Meanwhile, Xavier was probably still in yesterday's clothes screaming at 12-year-olds online, living in his own filth in that disaster of a bedroom that I had stopped trying to clean because every time I organized it or did his laundry, he would just let it descend back into chaos within 48 hours like some kind of entropy experiment. Let me guess. The boys needed their tank for tonight's very important digital battle that definitely couldn't wait? He asked while getting another glass from the cabinet, and the fact that he already knew the situation without me having to explain it made me realize just how often this must happen. How many times Hunter had probably witnessed Xavier choosing his games over me, had probably heard Xavier making excuses, or seen me sitting alone in the living room waiting for him to finish just one more match that always turned into 5 more matches. I laughed bitterly, the sound coming out harsh and broken, because if I didn't laugh, I was definitely going to cry, and I was still holding on to my dignity by my fingernails at this point. You know how he is, I said, trying not to cry while Xavier's yelling echoed from his room, his voice reaching new decibels as he apparently died again, and was flaming his teammates for their inadequacy, completely oblivious to the fact that his girlfriend was literally standing in his apartment after he had just ditched her on their anniversary. Or maybe he did know and just didn't care enough to stop playing, which somehow felt even worse. Hunter shook his head slowly, his expression a mixture of disappointment and frustration that seemed to be directed entirely at his roommate. And I noticed the way his jaw tensed, like he was physically restraining himself from marching into Xavier's room and unplugging his computer. Listen, Jules, I've seen him ditch you for regular game nights before, but really? On your anniversary? He actually looked angry for me, which was more emotion than Xavier knew how to show these days, because somewhere along the line, my boyfriend had lost the ability to express feelings about anything that didn't involve critical hits or loot drops or whatever the hell he cared about in those games that consumed every waking moment of his life. That's just messed up and you know it. He poured me a glass of wine from a bottle that cost more than Xavier had spent on me in months, probably more than Xavier had spent on me ever if I was being completely honest with myself, because my boyfriend's idea of a gift was usually something he grabbed from the drugstore on the way home, or a Steam game that he wanted to play anyway, so really it was more a gift for himself than for me. And I found myself comparing the thoughtfulness of Hunter pouring me expensive wine to comfort me with Xavier's complete inability to remember basic things about me, or our relationship, or what might make me happy. We sat there drinking at the kitchen counter, Hunter on one bar stool and me on the other, and the apartment felt weirdly intimate in that moment with Xavier's rage-filled gaming sounds providing a pathetic soundtrack to our conversation, and I realized this was more attention and genuine human interaction than I had gotten from anyone in weeks. Hunter actually listened when I talked about work, not just nodding along while clearly thinking about something else or checking his phone or waiting for his turn to talk about himself like Xavier always did on the rare occasions I could get him to engage in conversation at all. "Wait, you got promoted to regional manager?" he asked excitedly, his face lighting up with genuine happiness for my achievement, leaning forward on his stool like this was the most interesting thing he had heard all day. Xavier never mentioned that at all. That's huge. I realized my boyfriend didn't even know what my job actually was, but his roommate remembered every detail from our random kitchen conversations, could probably tell you more about my career goals and work challenges than Xavier could tell you about my favorite color, or my middle name, or literally any basic fact about the person he claimed to love. "I told Xavier about the promotion 2 weeks ago," I said, feeling that familiar ache in my chest that came with the realization that I was dating someone who couldn't be bothered to care about the important things in my life, who heard me talk about this massive career achievement that I had worked toward for years, and responded with the emotional equivalent of a shrug. He just said cool, and went back to his game. Hunter looked at me sincerely, his eyes holding mine in a way that Xavier hadn't looked at me in months, really looked at me like he was seeing me as a person, instead of just a background character in his life. "You deserve someone who throws you a party, not someone who can't look away from a screen." Something about the way he looked at me made my heart flutter in a way that felt dangerous and exciting and wrong, but also so right, because when was the last time someone had looked at me like I mattered, like I was worth paying attention to, like I was someone special instead of just an obligation or an afterthought? Hunter had been there for me more than my actual boyfriend just by answering the door when I showed up, just by offering me wine and conversation and basic human decency, just by remembering the things I told him and acting like my life had value. "Hey, Xavier, your girlfriend is here in a smoking hot dress," Hunter called out during a break in the shooting sounds, his voice loud and clear and carrying through the apartment with an edge that suggested he was done watching his roommate treat me like garbage, but Xavier just yelled back, "Tell her I'll be done in an hour." Without even a pause in his gameplay, without even bothering to come out and look at me or apologize or acknowledge that he had just ruined our anniversary plans, and I felt something inside me break, because an hour meant 3 hours minimum based on past experience. And even if he did finish in an hour, he would probably be too tired or too tilted from his games to actually want to go anywhere or do anything except complain about his teammates. Hunter's face went dark in a way I had never seen before, his usual easygoing expression hardening into something that looked almost protective, and he grabbed his car keys off the counter with a decisive movement that suggested he had just made up his mind about something. "You know what? Forget waiting around for him. I'm taking you to that anniversary dinner myself," he announced loud enough for Xavier to hear over his game, his voice carrying a challenge that hung in the air like a thrown gauntlet. And I felt my breath catch because this was crossing a line and we both knew it. But I also couldn't bring myself to say no, because the alternative was sitting here waiting for Xavier like a sad puppy, or going home alone to cry in this expensive dress. The gaming sounds cut off completely for the first time since I had arrived. the sudden silence almost deafening after the constant barrage of gunfire and explosions, and Xavier's angry commentary. And Xavier's door flew open so hard it hit the wall with a bang that probably left a dent in the drywall that their landlord was going to charge them for. And there he was, my boyfriend in all his glory, standing in the doorway looking absolutely ridiculous. "What did you just say?" Xavier demanded while still wearing his stupid gaming headset with the mic flipped up, his eyes wide and wild like he had just been pulled out of his virtual world and thrust back into reality against his will. And I noticed the way his hands were still positioned like he was holding a controller even though he wasn't. Muscle memory from spending every waking hour in that position. Hunter walked over and put his hand on my back, the touch gentle but firm and warm through the thin fabric of my dress. And I didn't pull away even though I knew I probably should have because this was escalating into something that couldn't be taken back. "I said I'm taking Jules to dinner since you're too busy playing games to treat her right," Hunter replied calmly, his voice steady and controlled in direct contrast to Xavier's obvious panic. And there was something in his tone that suggested he had been waiting for an excuse to do this, to finally call Xavier out on his bullshit, to stand up for me in a way that I had been too afraid or too codependent to stand up for myself. Xavier's face went red and he ripped off his headset while his friends' confused voices asked where he went, asking if he was coming back, wondering if his mic was broken, their tinny voices calling his gamertag over and over into the void. And I could see the internal struggle on Xavier's face as he tried to decide whether to deal with this situation or go back to his game where things made sense, and he had control, and people did what he told them to. His hair was sticking up in every direction from wearing the headset for hours, probably days if I was being honest, and he had Mountain Dew stains on his 3-day-old hoodie that I recognized as the same one he had been wearing the last time I came over, the fabric wrinkled and gross and smelling like stale chips and sweat. "She's my girlfriend, so back off, dickhead," Xavier shouted, but his voice cracked slightly on the words like he wasn't entirely convinced of his ownership claim anymore. "And honestly, could you even call yourself someone's boyfriend when you treated them like this? When you couldn't be bothered to shower or change clothes or remember important dates or show up for the person who was supposed to matter most to you?" But Hunter just laughed, a short bark of disbelief that seemed to sum up how absurd this whole situation was. "Really? Because you've been treating her like she doesn't exist." Hunter shot back while grabbing his jacket and keys, moving with purpose toward the door while keeping his hand on my back like he was guiding me, protecting me, claiming me in a way that Xavier never had. And I found myself moving with him because what else was I supposed to do? Stay here and wait for Xavier to finish his games and maybe possibly eventually acknowledge me? Xavier grabbed my arm desperately, his fingers wrapping around my wrist with a grip that was too tight and a little bit sweaty, and he started rattling off promises about how he'd skip next week's session and plan something special, words tumbling out of his mouth in a panicked stream that might have meant something if I hadn't heard variations of these same promises 100 times before. "I'll delete Discord right now. I'll sell my gaming PC," he said frantically while his friends kept calling his name through the abandoned headset that was now sitting on the floor where he had dropped it, and I could see the desperation in his eyes but also the complete lack of understanding about why I was upset, like he thought this was about the games themselves, and not about the fact that he had proven over and over that I would never be his priority, that I would always come second to whatever digital crisis demanded his attention. He looked pathetic standing there in his boxers with Cheeto dust on his fingers, the orange residue staining his skin and coating his fingernails like evidence of his lifestyle. And I wondered how I had let myself stay with someone who couldn't even maintain basic hygiene, who lived like this and thought it was acceptable, who valued his online reputation more than his real-life relationship. "You literally only care because someone else wants to treat me right," I said, the words coming out clearer and stronger than I expected. And I watched Xavier's face as the truth of that statement hit him, watched him realize that he hadn't actually cared about our anniversary or about me or about anything except maintaining his possession of me, like I was just another item in his inventory. Xavier's mouth opened and closed like he was buffering, his brain trying to process this situation and failing to come up with any response that would fix what he had broken. And I could see him struggling to find words that would make me stay, but coming up empty because maybe on some level even he knew that he didn't deserve me, that he had taken me for granted one too many times, that this was the inevitable conclusion of months of neglect and disrespect, and choosing pixels over the real person standing in front of him. I was already walking toward the door with Hunter beside me, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor with each step that took me further away from Xavier and closer to something new and uncertain, but definitely better than this. And I could feel Hunter's presence next to me solid and real and warm. "Jules, please don't do this," Xavier called out, his voice breaking on my name. And for a second I almost turned around because 2 years is a long time, and there were good memories buried under all the bad ones, moments when he used to make me laugh and hold my hand and act like he cared. But then I remembered that those moments were ancient history, and the person I fell in love with didn't exist anymore if he ever really existed at all. Xavier tried to follow us to the door, but his computer started pinging with Discord notifications, that familiar sound that had become the soundtrack to our failing relationship, and I saw his head turn toward his room like a trained dog. Update. His hand actually lifted toward his bedroom like his body was moving on autopilot. And I watched this pathetic moment happen in slow motion, where my boyfriend of 3 years physically could not stop himself from responding to a Discord ping even while watching me leave with another man. Hunter saw it too and just shook his head, pulling the apartment door open and guiding me through it with his hand still on my back. And I heard Xavier make this weird strangled sound behind us like his brain was short-circuiting trying to decide between his girlfriend and his game. The door closed behind us with a soft click that felt louder than it should have, and suddenly we were standing in the hallway, and I could still hear Xavier's muffled voice through the door saying my name, but also hearing the faint sound of his bedroom door closing, and I knew without looking that he had gone back to his computer because of course he had, because that's who he was now, someone who would choose virtual raids over real relationships even in the most critical moment. Hunter didn't say anything as we walked down the hallway toward the elevator, and I was grateful for the silence because I felt like if I tried to speak, I might start crying or screaming or laughing hysterically at the absurdity of what had just happened. My heels clicked on the tile floor with each step, that sharp sound echoing in the quiet hallway, and I focused on that noise instead of thinking about the fact that I had just walked out on a 3-year relationship. The elevator doors opened and we stepped inside, and Hunter pressed the button for the parking garage, and I watched the numbers light up as we descended, feeling like I was falling even though the elevator was moving smoothly. We reached the garage and walked through the concrete space toward Hunter's car, and I could see it was a nice sedan, clean, and well-maintained. Such a contrast to Xavier's car, which was full of fast food wrappers and empty energy drink cans and smelled like stale French fries. Hunter walked slightly ahead and opened the passenger door for me. Actually opened it. And stood there holding it like men did in old movies. And I realized Xavier hadn't opened a car door for me in probably 2 years. Maybe longer if I was being honest with myself. I slid into the leather seat and it was clean and comfortable, and Hunter closed the door gently before walking around to the driver's side. And I sat there in this nice car feeling like I had stepped into some alternate reality where men actually followed through on plans and treated dates like they mattered. Hunter got in and started the car, and soft music played from the speakers. Some jazz station that was sophisticated and calm, nothing like the aggressive gaming soundtracks that were constantly blasting from Xavier's speakers. We pulled out of the parking garage and onto the street, and the city lights looked different somehow. Brighter and more alive than they had when I drove here an hour ago, ready to confront my boyfriend about standing me up. Hunter glanced over at me and asked how my day at work had been. Just casual conversation like this was a normal date and not the most complicated situation I had ever been in. I started telling him about this project I was managing, and he actually listened, asking follow-up questions and making comments that proved he was paying attention, instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He asked about my promotion, wanted to know what my new responsibilities were, seemed genuinely interested in the details of my job, and I found myself talking more than I had planned because it felt so strange to have someone actually care about this stuff. The normalcy of it was almost surreal after years of one-sided conversations with Xavier, where I would try to tell him about work, and he would just nod while clearly thinking about his next gaming session. I realized halfway through explaining my new regional manager role that this was the longest conversation I had had about my career with anyone in months, and Hunter was remembering details I had mentioned in passing during those random kitchen encounters at Xavier's apartment, asking if that difficult client situation had resolved, and whether my team had hit their quarterly targets. We drove through the city streets and I watched the buildings pass by, the restaurants and shops all lit up for the evening, and Hunter kept the conversation going easily, talking about his own day at the architecture firm where he worked, describing this building design he was working on for a downtown development project. We pulled up to the Italian restaurant and Hunter handed his keys to the valet, coming around to open my door before I could even reach for the handle, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk feeling like I was in some kind of dream. The restaurant had soft lighting visible through the windows, looked expensive and romantic, exactly the kind of place I had imagined for our anniversary dinner. Hunter put his hand on my lower back again as we walked toward the entrance, that same gentle touch that somehow felt protective without being possessive, and the host greeted us at the door with a warm smile. Hunter gave his name and the host checked the reservation list, and I realized with a jolt that this was my reservation, the one I had made weeks ago for Xavier. And me and Hunter must have called ahead to change the name because the host was leading us to a table without any confusion. We walked through the restaurant past other couples having quiet dinners, and the host seated us at a corner table that had a candle flickering in the center, and a white tablecloth and actual cloth napkins, and I felt guilty for half a second before remembering that Xavier had chosen his game over this exact reservation, over this exact table, over me sitting here in this dress. The guilt evaporated and was replaced by something else, maybe anger or relief or some combination of both. Hunter pulled out my chair before sitting down across from me, and the waiter appeared almost immediately with menus and a wine list. Hunter didn't even look at the prices, Just ordered an expensive bottle of red wine that the waiter seemed impressed by, nodding approvingly before heading to get it. The wine arrived in minutes, and the waiter poured a small amount for Hunter to taste, going through the whole formal ritual that I had only seen in movies. And Hunter approved it, and the waiter filled both our glasses with the deep red liquid that caught the candlelight. Hunter raised his glass and looked at me across the table, his expression sincere and warm, and he said we should toast to my promotion, because that was a huge accomplishment, and I deserved to celebrate it properly. We clinked glasses, and I took a sip of the wine, and it was smooth and rich and probably cost more than Xavier had spent on me in the last 6 months. And my chest felt tight because this was exactly what tonight was supposed to be. This moment right here with someone who cared enough to make it special. The waiter came back and we ordered appetizers, and Hunter asked me to choose first. Said I should get whatever I wanted, and I picked the calamari because I loved it, but Xavier always complained it was too expensive. Hunter ordered bruschetta, and when the food arrived we shared both plates, and he told me he had been watching Xavier neglect me for months. And it had been driving him crazy because he couldn't understand how anyone could have me and treat me like an afterthought. His honesty caught me completely off guard, and I felt my face getting hot, that flush spreading across my cheeks that always happened when I was embarrassed or flustered. Hunter kept talking, saying he had tried to hint to Xavier that he needed to step up, had tried to be a good friend, and roommate by pointing out when he was being inconsiderate, but Xavier just didn't seem to get it or didn't care enough to change. I picked at the calamari on my plate and didn't know what to say, because this conversation was making me realize that this dinner might be about more than just proving a point to Xavier, that Hunter might have feelings I hadn't let myself acknowledge because he was Xavier's roommate, and therefore completely off limits in my mind. My phone started buzzing in my purse, that familiar vibration pattern that meant texts were coming through, and I pulled it out to see Xavier's name lighting up my screen over and over. The messages were progressing from apologies to anger to desperate pleas, each one more frantic than the last. And I scrolled through them feeling more annoyed than guilty because this was typical Xavier behavior, only caring when he was losing something, only putting in effort when it was too late. The phone kept buzzing, and I could feel Hunter watching me, and finally I just turned the whole thing off completely. Because I was tired of Xavier's crisis being the center of attention, tired of jumping every time he needed something, tired of organizing my entire life around his gaming schedule and his mood swings. Hunter noticed me shutting off my phone and said, "Good for you." Just those 3 words. But with genuine approval in his voice and something about his support, made me sit up straighter in my chair, made me feel more confident that walking out had been the right choice. The waiter cleared our appetizer plates and brought our entrees, and Hunter and I fell into easy conversation that lasted for 2 hours, just talking about everything. And nothing, and I learned that he worked in architecture designing commercial buildings, that he loved hiking and had done part of the Appalachian Trail last summer, that he read actual physical books instead of just gaming forums and Reddit threads. He was single, had been for 8 months after a relationship ended, and he asked about my career goals, and remembered details I had mentioned in passing during those kitchen conversations at Xavier's apartment, proving he had been paying attention all along while Xavier couldn't even remember what my job title was. The waiter brought dessert menus, and Hunter suggested we split the tiramisu, and when it arrived with 2 forks, he admitted something that made my heart start racing in a way that felt dangerous and exciting. He said he had been attracted to me since the day they moved in together, but he never acted on it because of the roommate situation, and because he kept hoping Xavier would get his act together and treat me the way I deserved to be treated. The confession hung in the air between us across the candlelit table, and I didn't know what to say because part of me had noticed the way Hunter looked at me too, had noticed how he always seemed to be around. When I visited, how he always made time to talk to me even when he was busy, though I had never let myself acknowledge it until this exact moment sitting here with him. I took a bite of tiramisu, and the sweetness felt too intense, and I could feel Hunter watching me carefully like he was trying to gauge my reaction without pushing me to respond. We finished dessert mostly in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, just heavy with everything that had been said and everything that was still unsaid. Hunter paid the check without even letting me see the total, waving away my attempt to contribute, and we left the restaurant and stepped out into the night air that had gotten colder while we were inside. Hunter suggested we walk through the nearby park because it was a nice evening, and neither of us seemed ready for this to end yet. And I agreed, even though my feet were killing me in these heels because the alternative was going home alone to process everything that had happened. We walked along the sidewalk toward the park entrance, and the autumn air was crisp and cool against my bare arms, and I shivered without meaning to. Hunter immediately took off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders without me having to ask, and it smelled like his cologne and felt warm from his body heat, and I pulled it tighter around myself as we entered the park. The paths were lit by old-fashioned street lamps that cast pools of yellow light, and there were other couples walking and joggers passing by, and everything felt surreal, like I was watching my own life happen from outside my body. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, just enjoying the night air and the crunch of fallen leaves under our feet, and eventually we found a bench that overlooked the city lights spread out below us in a glittering pattern. Hunter asked what I was going to do about Xavier, his voice careful and soft like he was trying not to push me in any direction. And I told him honestly that I didn't know. That 3 years was a long time, but so was a lifetime of coming second to video games. Hunter just nodded like he understood the weight of that decision. Didn't try to convince me one way or the other. Just sat there beside me on the bench being present in a way that Xavier had forgotten how to be. My phone turned back on automatically when the battery saver kicked in. That stupid feature I had enabled months ago, and suddenly it started buzzing like crazy with all the notifications that had been queued up while it was off. I pulled it out and saw 47 missed calls from Xavier plus texts from his gaming friends saying he was freaking out and asking what happened, and there were voicemails and more texts coming through in real time. Hunter glanced at my screen and said I didn't owe him an immediate response, which was something I needed to hear because I had spent 3 years jumping whenever Xavier needed something, always being available, always putting his needs first. I stared at the screen watching more texts come through, Xavier alternating between apologizing and getting angry and begging me to come back, and I felt nothing except maybe relief that I wasn't there dealing with this meltdown in person. Hunter sat quietly beside me on the bench, not rushing me or telling me what to do, just being there while I processed everything, and his jacket was still warm around my shoulders and smelled like safety somehow. Hunter opened the apartment door, and I walked through it without looking back, even though I could feel Xavier standing there in the hallway behind us watching me leave. The door closed with a quiet click, and we walked down the hallway toward the elevator, my heels making sharp sounds on the tile floor that echoed in the silence. Hunter pressed the elevator button and we waited, neither of us saying anything, and I kept my eyes straight ahead because if I looked at him, I might start crying or laughing or both. The elevator arrived and we stepped inside and rode down to the parking garage, the numbers lighting up as we descended, and I felt like I was falling even though we were moving smoothly. We reached his car and he opened the passenger door for me, actually held it open and waited for me to get in before closing it gently. The interior was clean and smelled like leather and air freshener, nothing like Xavier's car that was always full of trash and empty energy drink cans. Hunter got in the driver's side and started the engine, and soft music played from the speakers, some kind of jazz that felt calm and grown up. We pulled out of the parking garage and onto the street, and the city lights looked different now, sharper somehow, and I realized I was seeing everything through this weird lens of having just walked out on a 3-year relationship. Hunter asked if I was okay, and I nodded even though I wasn't sure if that was true, and he said we didn't have to talk if I didn't want to, that we could just drive. But then I started talking anyway, telling him about how Xavier used to be different when we first started dating, how he used to plan actual dates, and remember things I told him and act like spending time with me was something he wanted to do instead of something that interrupted his gaming schedule. Hunter listened without interrupting, just driving through the city streets while I word vomited 3 years of frustration and disappointment. He drove past the turn that would have taken us back to Xavier's apartment, and I realized he was heading toward my place instead, and something about that choice made my chest feel tight because it meant this was real. I had actually left. We pulled up outside my building and Hunter turned off the engine, but neither of us moved to get out. We just sat there in his car with the music playing softly. He told me about his ex Christina, how they broke up because he worked too much and never made time for the relationship, and how it taught him that you can't just be physically present, you have to actually show up emotionally too. He said watching Xavier treat me like background noise had been hard, because he could see I deserved so much better than someone who couldn't even remember to show up for anniversary dinner. We talked for another hour sitting in that car, about everything from what we wanted out of life to stupid childhood memories, and it felt easy in a way that talking to Xavier never did anymore. Eventually, I knew I had to go inside because it was getting late, and this whole situation was complicated enough without sitting in his car all night, so I reached for the door handle. Hunter said he had a great time at dinner, and that I deserved a proper anniversary regardless of what happened next with Xavier or with anything else. He didn't try to kiss me or make this into something more than it was, just squeezed my hand briefly before I got out of the car. I stood on the sidewalk watching his taillights disappear down the street, and I felt more confused and alive and terrified than I had in months, like I had just jumped off a cliff and wasn't sure if I was flying or falling. I went inside my building and climbed the stairs to my apartment, my feet screaming in these heels that I should have taken off hours ago. The second I got inside, I kicked off the shoes and grabbed my phone and called Penelope, my best friend who I should have called 3 hours ago. But everything had been happening too fast. She answered on the second ring asking where I had been because I was supposed to text her after dinner with Xavier. And I just started talking, telling her everything that happened from Xavier ditching me to Hunter taking me to dinner to the conversation in the car. Penelope listened and gasped at all the right moments, and when I finally stopped talking, she said she had been waiting for me to leave Xavier for over a year. She said everyone who knew us had watched him take me for granted, that our mutual friends had been talking about it for months, wondering when I would finally realize I deserved better. She said Hunter sounded like exactly the kind of man I should be with, someone who actually valued my time and remembered things I said, and treated dinner like it mattered. We talked for another hour, and I was still on the phone with her when I heard knocking on my apartment door, loud and insistent. I looked at the time and it was midnight, and I knew without checking who it was, because who else would show up at my apartment at midnight on our anniversary after I had just walked out on him? I told Penelope I had to go, and she made me promise to call her tomorrow, and I hung up and went to the door. Xavier was standing in the hallway looking terrible, his hair still unwashed and sticking up everywhere, wearing the same stained hoodie from earlier. He started begging me to talk to him through the door, his voice cracking as he said my name over and over, and I knew I should tell him to leave, but instead I opened the door like an idiot. He came inside and immediately launched into this speech about how he was going to change, how he would delete all his games and cancel his Discord and go to therapy, how he would be better and make me his priority. But while he was talking, his phone kept buzzing in his pocket, and I could see his eyes flicking down toward it every few seconds. That automatic response to notifications that he couldn't control even while supposedly pouring his heart out to me. I told him the problem wasn't the gaming itself. It was the fact that he had consistently chosen it over me for 3 years. That one dramatic gesture wouldn't fix a pattern of neglect and disrespect. He got defensive immediately, his voice getting louder as he brought up Hunter, accusing me of cheating and saying I was using this as an excuse to be with his roommate. I felt my anger rising because this proved he still didn't understand, that he thought this was about Hunter instead of about 3 years of being treated like I didn't matter. The argument escalated fast, both of us saying things we couldn't take back, and finally I told him he needed to leave, that I needed space to think, and he needed to actually reflect on his actions instead of just panicking about losing me. He started crying, saying he loved me and couldn't lose me, but even through his tears I could see him glancing at his phone when it buzzed. He left finally, and I watched through my window as he got in his car, and the second he sat down, he pulled out his phone, probably already texting his gaming friends about how unfair I was being. I spent the next 3 days avoiding everyone, calling in sick to work even though I wasn't physically ill, just emotionally exhausted. I ignored texts from Xavier and didn't respond when Hunter messaged asking if I was okay. I just stayed in my apartment wearing sweatpants and eating ice cream and trying to figure out what I actually wanted. Penelope came over on day 2 with wine and Chinese takeout, and we talked through my entire relationship history with Xavier, identifying all the red flags I had ignored because I kept hoping he would become the person he was when we first started dating. She helped me see that I had been making excuses for him for years, convincing myself that things would get better if I just loved him enough, or supported him enough, or waited long enough. On day 4, I finally went back to work, and Eleanor Frost, my boss, noticed immediately that something was wrong. She pulled me aside during lunch and asked if everything was okay, her voice gentle but concerned. I gave her a vague explanation about relationship troubles, not wanting to dump all my drama on my boss, but she nodded like she understood more than I was saying. She told me she had stayed in a bad relationship for 5 years before finally leaving, that she kept thinking she could fix him, or that things would magically improve. But eventually she realized that sometimes the hardest part is admitting you have outgrown someone. Her words hit me hard because that was exactly what had happened. I had outgrown Xavier and our relationship, but I had been too scared to admit it. That evening, Hunter texted me for the first time since dropping me off. Just a simple message saying he hoped I was doing okay, and that he was available if I wanted to talk, but no pressure. The message was so different from Xavier's constant bombardment of texts and calls and voicemails, and I appreciated that Hunter was giving me the space Xavier never learned to provide. I stared at the message for a long time before responding, suggesting we meet for coffee the next day, keeping it casual and public, because I needed to understand if what I felt at dinner was real or just the high of being treated well for once. We met at a coffee shop downtown the next afternoon, and I got there first and sat at a corner table feeling nervous and guilty and excited all at the same time. Hunter arrived right on time, which shouldn't have impressed me but did after years of Xavier being late to everything, and he sat down across from me with his coffee. We started talking, and hours passed without me noticing, the conversation flowing easily from topic to topic. And I realized this was what a healthy connection actually felt like, when someone listened and responded and remembered things you said, and acted like getting to know you was interesting instead of inconvenient. Hunter walked me to my car after we finally left the coffee shop, the sun already setting because we had been talking for almost 5 hours straight without noticing the time pass. He opened my car door and said he wanted to see me again, that this felt different and special, and I agreed because spending time with him felt easy in a way that being with Xavier never had. We made plans for dinner later that week, and I drove home feeling lighter than I had in months, like I had finally made a choice that was actually good for me instead of just convenient or comfortable. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls from Xavier and a string of angry texts saying Bruce had seen me at the coffee shop with Hunter, that people were talking about us, that I was making him look like an idiot in front of all his friends. I ignored the messages and went to work, focusing on the regional manager training materials that Eleanor had given me, trying to stay busy so I wouldn't think about the inevitable confrontation that was coming. Xavier showed up at my apartment that evening, pounding on the door so hard I thought he might break it. And when I opened it, he pushed past me into my living room looking worse than he had the night of our anniversary. His eyes were red like he hadn't slept. His hair was greasy and unwashed, and he was wearing sweatpants and a gaming tournament shirt that had visible stains on the front. He started yelling immediately, saying I had moved on too fast, that Hunter had betrayed him as a roommate by taking me out, that everyone in his Discord server was talking about how his girlfriend left him for his roommate. I let him rant for a few minutes, watching him pace back and forth across my living room, and I realized he wasn't upset about losing me specifically. He was upset about losing in general, about the narrative that he had been replaced. When he finally stopped to catch his breath, I told him we were done, that I couldn't be with someone who only valued me. When someone else showed interest, and that his reaction to losing me proved he cared more about winning than about actually being a good partner. Xavier's face went red and he tried to argue, bringing up all the times he had been there for me. But I cut him off and reminded him of the anniversary dinner he ditched, the promotion he forgot about, the 3 years of coming second to his games. He deflated then, his shoulders slumping as the anger drained out of him, and he asked if there was any chance we could work things out, his voice small and desperate. I shook my head and told him no, that I needed someone who showed up for me consistently, not just when they were scared of losing, and that I hoped he would figure out what he actually wanted from life. He left without another word, just turned and walked out of my apartment, and I watched through my window as he sat in his car for 10 minutes before finally driving away. The relief I felt was immediate and overwhelming, like I had been holding my breath for 3 years and could finally exhale, and I called Penelope to tell her it was officially over. She came over with wine and we celebrated my freedom, talking about all the red flags I had ignored, and all the ways Xavier had taken me for granted, and for the first time in years I felt excited about my future, instead of anxious about my present. Hunter texted me the next day, asking how I was doing, and I told him about Xavier showing up in our final conversation, and he said he had something to tell me when we met for dinner. We went to a nice steakhouse that Friday, and Hunter looked serious when we sat down, telling me that Xavier had moved out of their apartment 3 days ago and gone to stay with Bruce. He said Xavier had left behind a complete mess, dirty dishes piled in the sink, trash overflowing, his bedroom looking like a disaster zone. Plus, he owed 2 months of unpaid rent that Hunter was now stuck covering. Hunter seemed more disappointed than angry, explaining that he had tried to be a good friend to Xavier, had tried to help him get his life together, but he couldn't watch him self-destruct anymore. I realized then that Hunter had been dealing with Xavier's immaturity as a roommate the same way I had dealt with it as a girlfriend, both of us making excuses and trying to help someone who didn't want to help themselves. We talked about Xavier for a while, processing the end of those relationships, and then Hunter changed the subject and asked if I wanted to try dating for real, taking things slow and seeing where it went. I said yes without hesitation because everything about being with Hunter felt right. From the way he listened when I talked to the way he remembered small details, to the way he treated spending time with me like it actually mattered. We started seeing each other officially after that, waiting 2 full weeks after Xavier moved out to make sure we were doing this for the right reasons, and not just as a reaction to the breakup. Hunter planned actual dates, taking me to art museums and concerts and new restaurants, showing up exactly when he said he would, texting me good morning and asking about my day, treating me like I was someone special instead of an obligation. The difference was staggering, going from someone who barely acknowledged my existence to someone who made me feel valued and appreciated, and I found myself laughing more and stressing less and actually enjoying my life. 3 weeks into dating Hunter, I got a message on social media from Christina, his ex-girlfriend, saying she had heard through mutual friends that we were together. My stomach dropped when I saw the message because I thought she was going to tell me Hunter was terrible or warn me away. But instead, she said she wanted me to know that Hunter was genuinely a good guy who had learned from their relationship ending. She explained that they broke up because of timing and his workaholic tendencies, that he used to spend every waking hour at the architecture firm and never made time for them as a couple, but that he had been working on finding balance. She said she was happy he found someone who appreciated his efforts, and that she hoped things worked out for us, and the message was so kind and genuine that I actually teared up reading it. I showed Hunter the message when we met for dinner that night, and he looked embarrassed but also touched, admitting that losing Christina had taught him that relationships require actual presence and effort, not just showing up physically while being mentally checked out. He said he didn't want to make the same mistakes with me, that he was committed to being present and making us a priority, and his honesty made me fall for him even harder. The months passed quickly, filled with real dates and actual conversations and weekend trips to the coast, and I barely thought about Xavier except to feel grateful that I had finally left. 3 months after our breakup, I ran into Xavier at the grocery store, literally almost crashed my cart into his in the produce section, and I barely recognized him at first because he looked so different. His hair was cut and styled, he was clean-shaven, he was wearing actual clothes instead of gaming shirts, and he looked healthier overall, like he had been sleeping and eating real food. He saw me and his face went pale, but he didn't run away, just stood there holding a basket of vegetables and looking uncomfortable. I said hi because ignoring him felt childish, and he asked if we could talk for a minute, his voice quiet and nervous. We stood there between the lettuce and the tomatoes, and he told me he had been in therapy for 2 months, that he had cut back on gaming significantly, that losing me had been the wake-up call he needed to realize his life was a mess. He apologized genuinely for how he had treated me, admitting he took me for granted and prioritized the wrong things, and he said he hoped I was happy now. I told him I appreciated the growth and that I was genuinely glad he was working on himself, but that we were both better off apart, and he nodded like he understood. We said goodbye and went our separate ways, and I felt nothing except mild relief that he seemed to be doing okay. No lingering feelings or regrets or what-ifs. Hunter and I moved in together after 4 months of dating, finding a nice 2-bedroom apartment with big windows and a balcony, and the difference between living with someone who was present versus someone who was always mentally checked out was staggering. We cooked dinner together every night, trying new recipes and making a mess of the kitchen, and we had actual conversations about our days and our dreams and our plans for the future. We went on weekend trips to nearby cities, exploring museums and hiking trails and new restaurants, building a life together that felt balanced and healthy and real. I found myself laughing at his jokes and looking forward to coming home and making plans for our future without that constant anxiety that had defined my relationship with Xavier. On what would have been my 4-year anniversary with Xavier, Hunter surprised me by taking the day off work and telling me to pack a bag for the weekend. He drove us 3 hours into the mountains to this beautiful bed and breakfast, a old converted farmhouse with a fireplace and a view of the valley below. We spent Saturday hiking through trails covered in autumn leaves, the air crisp and cold, and Hunter held my hand the entire time, pointing out birds and talking about his dreams of designing sustainable buildings. That evening, we sat on the porch of the bed and breakfast, wrapped in blankets and drinking hot chocolate, and I realized I was genuinely happy for the first time in years. Not just content or comfortable, but actually happy. I looked at Hunter and felt grateful that I had finally chosen myself that night in the emerald dress, that I had walked out the door instead of staying and making excuses. My life was so much better now with someone who actually showed up for me, who remembered the things I said, who treated our relationship like it mattered, and I knew without any doubt that I had made the right choice.